Right. So a little bit about me. My name is Mark Del Gershio. I'm an enrolled agent, which is a license that's granted from the Internal Revenue Service. And I'm not a lawyer. I just want to clarify that. So we're not going to give you any legal advice tonight, but I am licensed to practice before the IRS. And for a great deal of what we're going to talk about tonight, it's definitely weighed more towards the tax side of things because we're talking about a process to apply to the Internal Revenue Service. So I'm also a National Tax Practice Institute fellow, and I just had to say that. I think it sounds cool. All right, so let's get started. I want to have a little fun tonight. One of the things that nonprofits are something that a lot of people say when we talk to clients, they always say, this was something that's been in my heart for a long time. And a lot of times it's germinated or starts from something serious, right? Something that's happened. And we'll talk a lot about all the different types of nonprofits and really kind of expand your thinking a little bit about this. So what we do is really help people start and grow nonprofits and foundations and work with Anderson Advisors to do that for their clients as well. So who this call is for, let's just get into this right now. Of course, this call is going to be for people who are serious about starting a nonprofit or foundation and truly want to serve more people and have a greater impact on the world. And one of the most exciting things about working with nonprofits is how many people are having a great impact. It's amazing. This is truly a movement, and it's very exciting. We see what's happening. All right. Who the call's not for? Well, it's not for people who are only interested in having a for-profit business. Now, absolutely, there's nothing wrong with for-profit businesses. I've been working with them for 30 years. But tonight's call, we're going to talk about nonprofits because one of the fundamental pieces about nonprofits is that you can't personally benefit. In other words, you can pay yourself salaries. You can have benefits just like a for-profit business. And we'll talk about how that works. But there aren't things like shareholders. There isn't this direct cash benefit or profits that go to the owners or go to the founders. That's why it's called a nonprofit. But clearly a lot of people work for nonprofits. In fact, about 10% of the people that are employed in the United States work for nonprofit organizations. All right, so it's also not for people without a charitable intent or a special message to share. So it's very important that we have some type of charitable intent or a special message. Not all nonprofits are necessarily charitable. We think of charities, we think of things like United Way and Humane Society and different things, but it could also be something that just shares a message, and we'll get into that a little bit. And of course, it's not for people who intend to defraud the government or to avoid paying taxes. So, and I know that's none of you today. So then, and there's quite a vetting process that goes into approving these, and the IRS is well aware of people that have been out there trying to avoid or even worse, evade taxes, and certainly we don't want you to do that. We're not going to promote that or tolerate it as well. So that's the plan. Now, here's the thing. What we want to do is get you from point A to point B, which is really simply where you are today to point B, where you want to be. It sounds pretty easy, right? Reason we put it in this context is because people are all over the place. Some people have been thinking about doing this for a long time but haven't done anything yet. Other people went to the irs.gov and they downloaded the forms and they started them. We had somebody say, they use it as a placemat. They've had it sitting for 6 months. They can't get through it. And some of the other processes as well. So we're going to give you a good background here about kind of how to take you from A to Z, and more importantly, how to do this in the least amount of time. This is a very time-intensive process. Up until about 3 months ago, the average application was taking 6 months to a year. Good news is they're moving a lot faster now. There's a lot of challenges over at the IRS. So we want you to be able to do this in a very efficient way, and we also want you to avoid some of the common traps. And so what I'm going to share with you tonight are some of the things that people don't know. After doing thousands of these applications, there's a lot of nuances, all right, that are just not in the code. They're not in the instructions, and we'll talk about some of those secrets, some of the traps. Now, here's what we've learned, and this is from the IRS's own statistics. Despite the difficulty of this process, 75% of the applications are self-prepared. That means 75% of the people that are submitting these have tried to do it on their own. And the IRS caseload in this division has increased by 400%. Now, I want to give you some perspective about what they call EO and GE, which is exempt organizations and government entities. It's the smallest department in the Internal Revenue Service. So the IRS has about 85,000, 90,000 employees. EOGE, as it's called, only has about 900 employees. Now, here's some of the things that they do. They process all of these IRS applications for exemption for nonprofits. They also manage all pension plans in the United States. So they administer every pension plan, 401k, when you hear these section codes, defined benefit plans, profit sharing plans, all of these things, they administer all of those 5,500 as tax returns that are filed. So that's a lot of work. Can you imagine that? They do all of that. They manage all the government entities and filings. So it's a very busy department. Oh, and all the tax returns for nonprofits, because nonprofits generally file returns, and that's about 1.5 million returns. That whole department has 900 people. So imagine how busy they are, and this caseload's increased dramatically. And then on top of it, there was this controversy that went on, and it was on the national news for about a week back in May of last year, and it was amazing to me because, wow, all of a sudden, nonprofits and the exempt organization division, the people that I talk to on a frequent basis, all of a sudden were in the news, right, because of the controversy related to that little department and those, missing emails on Lois Lerner and all that stuff. So a lot of stuff going on over there. Now, there's a lack of clear step-by-step instructions, including what not to do. Now, there are a ton of instructions. You can go to irs.gov and you can download the 38 pages of instructions. You could try to figure it out. You can go to the IRM, the Internal Revenue Manual. It's all public information. The problem is it's not very clear. It's written in IRS language, right? So we have to kind of decipher that, figure out what it is, what are they asking, and of course there's no what not to do guide. Like here's some of the technicalities, but they don't tell you what not to do. So what this leads to is people getting frustrated, they feel overwhelmed, or frankly they just give up. And a lot of what we do is what we'll call rescue operations, where we have folks that have gotten somewhere in this process and literally have given up, or their applications are over at the Internal Revenue Service, they haven't heard anything, or some of the other processes that I'll talk about this evening. All right, so you might be asking, what? Yes.
Sorry, interrupting you before you get into that. Some people are asking a couple questions, and one of them I just want to clarify with everybody. When you're on the page watching this video, you're going to see a little blue box pop up, and it does ask, hi, I'm the website greeter. Just ignore that. Don't type anything in there. That's not where you ask questions. So some people are asking questions through that. Questions will be done down on the bottom, underneath the form and everything else down on the very bottom. So don't use the blue pop-up for the questions. But feel free to ask away, and we'll get to all the questions towards the end. Sorry, go ahead.
And I am excited about the questions, by the way. I live for the questions. All right, so you might be thinking or asking, what are the benefits to starting a nonprofit or foundation? Or you might be wondering, well, what's the difference between a nonprofit and foundation? I hear these terms all the time. We hear them in the news, but what's the difference? What does that mean? You might wonder what the application process is really all about, right? It's somewhat of a mystery. Can we help you get unstuck? Or, simply how do you get started? So I'm going to address all of these things tonight, and I think that's, if you get a takeaway from this, getting this overview and this 30,000-foot view of what nonprofits are and answering these questions, I think will be really beneficial for you. So let's start with the types of nonprofits and where this terminology comes from. And there are really three primary types of nonprofits. And the first, and again, what we're talking about, we use this word nonprofit, really the correct term might be exempt organizations or tax-exempt organizations, right, which include a lot of things. But we're talking about charitable organizations or things that we think of in this term, nonprofit. Private foundations come to mind. Now, what's the distinction? Well, a private foundation basically is funded by one person's money or one family's money or one corporation's money. So, we have a picture of Warren Buffett up here. He has the Warren Buffett Foundation. And a private foundation, one of the key distinctions, besides the fact that it's funded usually from a single source of money. In other words, private foundations aren't out soliciting. They're not out doing fund drives. They're not fundraising. They're not doing Girl Scout cookie sales or anything like that. They're funded with, generally speaking, wealthier people's money or companies, right? But here's a distinction. Private foundations do not operate their own programs, all right? So they donate to other nonprofits, right? And there's obviously some tax benefits and advantages for people to do that. Now, the second type of nonprofit here that we're talking about are private operating foundations. And when we think of private operating foundations, a great example are Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, because they have a foundation. It is funded by Bill and Melinda's personal net worth. It's also significantly funded by Warren Buffett's private foundation, and that's why they're all pictured there on Fortune from a couple years ago. But the distinction here is that private operating foundations operate their own program. So, for example, one of the initiatives of the Gates Foundation is to eradicate a lot of global health problems, right? They just yesterday or the day before committed another $25 million towards fighting Ebola from their operating foundation. So think of operating foundations as organizations that have boots on the ground. But the key here is that they're not soliciting funds. Again, they're not doing their own fundraising or anything like that. They're self-funded. And the last department here, section that we'll think about nonprofit organizations are what we'll call publicly supported charities or 501c3s. 501c3 just being that section code of the IRS, just like 401k, it's just the reference to the section code. And when we think about nonprofits in the traditional sense and charities, for the most part, we're thinking about publicly supported charities, right? These are the United Ways, the Humane Societies, the American Cancer Society, all of the things that we know about as publicly supported charities fall into this category. Now, some of the other organizations fall in there as well. So religious organizations, churches, they're not really publicly supported in the traditional sense, but they fall into the same category of 501c3. It's a very large category, and most nonprofits fall into that section code. Now, there's a simple definition for 501c3, and all 501c3s have to fall into one of these categories. So charitable, religious, educational, scientific, literary, testing for public safety, fostering amateur sports competition, or preventing cruelty to children or animals. That's it. Pretty simple, right? Except that it's been expanded. So over the years, through Treasury regulations, through RevProc rulings, through revenue rulings, through all kinds of tax court cases, all kinds of things, administrative, judicial, things that have happened where this definition has been expanded to include a lot of different other organizations, let's say. But in some way or another, they're charitable, they're educational, they could be religious. Those are the most common, or they're preventing cruelty to children or animals, right? So this is a general catch-all, and then there's a lot of detail that goes into what other types of organizations fall into 501c3. Now, there are other categories of 501c, and when we think back to this IRS controversy back a little bit more than a year and a half, or roughly a year and a half ago, that was all about the 501c4s, and it was about social benefit companies and political influence and some restrictions on all of that. I won't get into the technical side of it, but understand that there are a number of other 501c organizations, so things like agriculture, food co-ops, and stuff like that. Recreational clubs, it's a car club down there, shooting clubs, gun clubs, people that want to go golfing, things like that. Those fall into some of these other categories. And of course, everyone's favorite charity, the NFL, because the NFL is a tax-exempt nonprofit. And a lot of people are surprised to know that, but it is actually a 501c6 established in 1966 by a special act of Congress. When they say it takes an act of Congress, it actually did in this case. But imagine back in 1966, the NFL wasn't the gigantic multi-billion-dollar business it is today. So, just as a distinction, the teams are for-profit, but the league itself is actually tax-exempt with over $250 million in revenue. Now, think about it. So, other types of categories, associations, homeowners associations, business leagues, social benefit companies, recreational clubs, all of these things, there's a lot of them. The main distinction between 501c3 and all the other 501cs is that they're tax exempt, but the donations are not deductible. I know a lot of you are disappointed that you cannot write a tax deductible check to the NFL. Everybody had their checkbooks out, feel bad about for the NFL wanting to write some money to them. You can do that, of course, but you cannot write it off. So that's the distinction there. And, another way that I like to explain this is that 501c3 status is really a favored status because not only are you tax exempt, but generally speaking, your donors are allowed to deduct a portion of their contribution. And that's a major reason why people support charities, of course. Okay. So what are the benefits of 501c3? I'm going to just go through this really fast because I think most people intuitively know these. First one, mentioned this several times, tax exempt. So generally speaking, 501c3s don't pay any income tax. Now, of course, when you understand, you look at tax law and everything that involved with the law and taxes, there's a lot of exceptions. And yes, nonprofits can absolutely have a form of taxable income. They can pay taxes, and there's certain conditions that can occur. But generally speaking, they're tax exempt. Again, generally speaking, donations are deductible to the extent of the donor's tax picture, right? But that's the whole idea. Hey, make a tax deductible contribution. One of the things people don't always think about is access to funding. And, when you're like in some of these public peer-to-peer lending sources now, like Indiegogo and GoFundMe and all of these areas where you can go out and get funding now online, I mean, one of the things that nonprofits can do is go out there and access that funding. People are more willing to support you if you have that tax-exempt status, that blessing, the letter, what they call letter of recognition from the IRS. So it's pretty cool. Media exposure. It's funny when you start paying attention to nonprofits, you see them everywhere, right? So, and where you see them, where they show up a lot is on the news. The NBC Nightly News, they always have almost nightly a story about a nonprofit. CNN Heroes. I mean, 60 Minutes sometimes if you watch that show. Almost sometimes every segment in an hour episode is about a nonprofit. It's fascinating. People don't really making the connection consciously. Wow, this is like really good, feel-good type stories, right? So when you have that nonprofit, you have the nonprofit corporation, you have that tax exemption from the IRS, guess what? The media likes to tell these stories. It's pretty cool. We've had clients that have been on, the Today Show, the CBS Evening News, I mean, you name it, all kinds of national media, just regular old folks, simply because they started a nonprofit, they're doing something really good and cool. And finally, legitimacy, and this ties into why you want to go out and get the exemption letter. It says that the IRS has vetted your organization, and they've gone through the due diligence process, as have you, to present the information, and they're giving you the blessing. All right. So we talked about getting started, and I like to say, think in terms of milestones. This is Mount Hood up in Oregon. I was there once on July 4th, and it looked just like that, covered in snow. It was amazing, in the middle of July. When we think in terms of milestones, if we were going to climb Mount Hood or any mountain, what we wouldn't do is just throw on our sandals and some kind of Bermuda shorts or whatever and just start walking up, right? People actually try to do stuff like that. That's why you hear these rescues. So when we're taking on a large project, what we're going to do is we want to chunk it down, right? We're going to move a certain direction. We're going to pick up some equipment. We're going to leave some things behind. But we're going to break this down into steps, right? Into processes that can be accomplished. And I'll tell you the challenge when I talk to people all the time that have tried this on their own is they jump in at the wrong place, and of course they get stuck. They haven't taken this kind of methodical process, right? So what I'm going to do is just break this down to 3 specific milestones. We're going to focus mostly on 2 and 3, but we'll talk a little bit about corporate structure. And of course, that's what Anderson Advisors does, is set up your nonprofit corporation, because this is one of the specific conditions, right, that you have to have this entity other than you. So I want you to think in terms of getting that corporate structure in place. Then we'll talk about IRS application, and then kind of one of those secrets that not everybody talks about, which is the IRS response. What happens once your application goes in? So here it is, leading up to the 5 secrets to starting a nonprofit. And I got to tell you, they're really not secrets. The secret is doing some of this stuff and doing it in the order, right, that it needs to occur. So when we talk about starting a nonprofit, we want to get clear about our mission. I'm going to talk about mission statement a little bit, our people and our programs, right? So what are we doing, who's doing it, and how is it going to be accomplished? Talk about the corporate structure, critical piece. Anderson Advisors help you with that, right? This is the formal corporate structure that you need before you can make application to the IRS. And we'll talk about that application, something called narratives and explanations. Sounds a little foreign. Not something everybody talks about because it's the off-the-form requirements. By the way, if you've looked at the form, that's not the only thing that's submitted. Our packets can run 50 to 75 pages because narratives and explanations. And then what happens when you get an IRS response letter? How do you handle that? All right, so starting with your mission, your organization's purpose and reason for being. And, I looked for a really good example of a mission statement. And the funny thing about mission statements, and I know David's very familiar with this, the concept of the elevator pitch. If you were in an elevator for 15 seconds or you had 30 seconds and somebody said, hey, what do you do? Or that conversation started. What do you say? Like about your business, it was a great opportunity. That's what a lot of people do. So they haven't thought it through. The same thing's true about the mission statement for the nonprofit, right? So Kiva is an organization that was started about 10, 12 years ago, a couple college students from Stanford. It's now one of the largest nonprofits in the world. And what they do, and very simply, is they make microloans to people in third world countries to start businesses. And about 75% of those loans go to women, and the average loan is about $35, $50, right? Very small loans to people that really need the money, but not just charity, but to start a business, to buy a goat, to do stuff like that so they can actually do something. So you can imagine the complexities. And over 99% of all the loans are paid back. And so people, do this. They help people other places they've never met. A lot of complexity. Here's their mission statement: to connect people through lending for the sake of alleviating poverty, right? That's 11 words. So Kiva has a lot of moving parts. Very simple mission statement. I want to break this down for you. I think a lot of people like this because they struggle with their mission statement. They say, wow, how do I get this down to one sentence? I have so many programs and I want to do so many things. And so I say, use our 3 superheroes, right? So the 3 superheroes. That's a little crazy, but follow along with me. First is the focus, right? So what is the purpose of your organization, the audience? Who are you speaking to? Now think about this for a minute. Your audience could be a certain segment, right, of the population. It may not be the general audience. It may be people that have a very specific interest or need, right? And then the connection, how is it done? So we look at Kiva's mission statement: to connect people through lending for the sake of alleviating poverty. I want to point something out here. Notice their focus, the purpose, the reason that Kiva exists is to alleviate poverty. It's not to be a lender. It's not to connect people. That's the connection, how it's done. Obviously, the audience is people in this case, but their focus, their purpose is alleviating poverty worldwide, right? So pretty cool. Deceptively simple, I must say. We do a lot of reviews of mission statements, and all the time we help people with this because your mission statement goes on that application. It's going to be part of your documents, and you want to be really clear. Think about this for a minute. You have these examiners at the IRS. They get stacks and stacks and stacks of these. I told you there's very few people in the department that actually reviews these. I probably know most of them by name now because I get all the letters and I talk to them. They're looking at these things, a lot of applications. So more clarity, the better, more well thought out this whole process is, the better you are at articulating, right? That goes a long way. So think about this in that kind of first steps. Developing your mission statement. Okay, rallying your people. Don't spend a lot of time on this. This is really about, the corporation, some of those functionalities inside that corporation. But one of the key things you want to do is identify your organization's officers and directors, right? And so think of it this way. Officers are the people that run the organization on a day-to-day basis, and the directors are the people that oversee the direction of the organization. They oversee the officers, and they oversee the overall plan here to make sure that the organization stays on target with its mission. Now, very common question always comes up. Well, it's only me or some family members or a couple people or somebody, a couple people from our church. We don't have a whole group. That's fine. That's okay. And your officers and directors can overlap. In fact, from the Internal Revenue Service's perspective, they know that most small organizations are going to have a commonality, of officers and directors. But as they get bigger, of course, these groups start to split off. And when you have large organizations, and I've been on the board of a number of them, you'll have a board of directors, and they oversee these officers, and they're not the officers. They're not doing day-to-day. Okay. People always ask, when's the best time? When do I need to put my people together? Now. All of this is now, right? This is when you're getting your people together. You're thinking about who's going to be involved in this, who is going to be on your corporate structure, right, from officers and directors' perspective and disclosure and all of that, right? So Anderson Advisors help you with that. But start thinking about who are your people. Now, which leads right to corporate structure. Okay. So, some of the things that come up, and I'm just going to cover quickly on this, but corporations, LLCs, hybrids, there's hybrid organizations now, and of course, corporations are based on state laws. So, some states have created other types of entities. They're semi-charitable, they're semi-profitable. And of course, anytime a state creates something like that, it takes the IRS a pretty fair amount of time to figure out from a tax perspective, how is it going to be taxed? Now, technically, you can apply for nonprofit status as a limited liability company, as an LLC. I can tell you it is extremely difficult to do. And one of the things that is in the IRS hot list, if you will, in other words, it gets escalated to the highest grade of examiner because LLCs, fundamentally are flow through, right? So if you know anything about LLCs, it's not about passing profits to owners, right? So while you statutorily can use an LLC, we don't recommend it, and it's very difficult. So here's what we're talking about: a nonprofit corporation, right? And folks at Anderson can help determine which state's going to be best for you. It's less state-specific than for-profit companies because, remember, it's tax-exempt. So, there's not that motivation perhaps at some type of state tax angle or something like that. Tax-exempt fundamentally. And some of these components, articles, so the articles are filed. Bylaws, while not specifically part of your corporate structure that's filed with the state, okay, bylaws aren't filed with the state, but they are part of your corporate structure because they're like the constitution of the organization. They describe how this nonprofit corporation is going to function. And from the context of the IRS, they must be submitted with the application. So you need IRS compliant bylaws. Okay, so I call them part of the corporate structure. Again, bylaws aren't something that are filed formally, but something that you must have. And then there's this piece called the required language. And I want everybody to remember this because required language is one of those major traps that occurs, and I'm going to circle back around to it, okay? But just keep that in mind because that derails a lot of folks. All right. We've got through this kind of structural piece, that beginning milestone 1. Now we're at the application process. So here's a little statistics for you. IRS gets between 60 and 70,000 applications a year, okay? So every year, that's roughly the number. Sometimes there's ebb and flows and increases, or what happens is that workloads slow down because of other things like the controversy, and so the work just stacked up. It was crazy for a while. The application itself, the formal application, is 31 pages with 38 pages of instruction. And if you've ever done a more complex tax return and, or something like that, and you start reading this stuff, you go, I don't know what they're asking, right? It's a little bit, I'm a tax person. It can be confusing, okay? Now, one of the good things that's occurred is there's now a second path, which is called Streamline. So there's a long form and there's a Streamline process. And one of the things that we'll do is, if we talk to you, we'll make a determination. Do you need to do the long form or can you do Streamline? Good news about Streamline, it's a lot simpler of a process. Long form, good news about that, you're providing a lot of data to the IRS, a lot of information up front. And I don't want to get too technical here, but I will say that one of the potential challenges with Streamline, much shorter process, is that the IRS, which they have already said this, they're going to circle back around and do more due diligence later. So people that think they're just going to, pass through their application and not go through a due diligence process, they may be surprised on the other end because a year or two from now, they may go through a more rigorous examination process. Where the long form, we're providing a tremendous amount of detail up front. Okay, the 2012 Tax Advisory Committee came up with these statistics. Of those 70,000 that go into the IRS every year, 10% receive no determination. Because you've done all of this work. You've set up your nonprofit corporation. You wrote your mission statement. You got your people. You filled out the application. You did the narratives, the financial projections. All of this work that sometimes takes people a tremendous amount of time to get no determination. That means you weren't approved or denied. And I think that is the worst place to be, right? Nothing's happened. And it's just sitting. And sometimes they sit for years. Okay. Now, 40% of the applications take 6 months or longer. This was back in 2012. I can tell you in 2013, in the first half of this year, the average application was taking significantly longer than 6 months. Within the last 3 months, they've sped up quite a bit. Something's happening over there. They're moving through a lot of these. This is actually a very good time to get an application in process. They've worked through a lot of the backlog. And by the way, the folks over at Exempt Organizations are wonderful people. Their goal over there at the IRS and this department is not to give people a hard time. Remember, this is the only part of the division of the IRS that doesn't collect income tax or taxes generally, right? So they're good people, but they're tasked with a very difficult job, which is to vet out the fraud, to vet out people that are just trying to avoid taxes, right? To really find these organizations that legitimately are nonprofits that legitimately need to be approved. And it's quite a task. And so, that's why some of these take a long time. They sit in a queue. Foreign organizations, if you're doing something outside the U.S., there's what's called OFAC, the Office of Financial Asset Control. And so, they want to know, are you working with suspected terrorists? I mean, they have to ask these questions, and you have to do the due diligence and answer them. People don't realize this when they step into this process. Now, I mentioned earlier, 75% are self-prepared, so you do the math. That means 25% are professionally prepared. I like to think, because I'm one of the professionals that prepares these, that goes a long way in getting these approved. And I'll tell you for a couple of reasons. Number one, we know what we're doing. So, obviously we know how to answer the questions. We know what kind of questions are going to come back. But there's another piece as well that people don't realize, and it's line 7 on the 1023. And line 7 on the 1023 application says, are you being represented by somebody, and if so, who? And they have to be licensed to represent you, right? So when the IRS screens these, and on the narrative and on the instruction form, I'm giving you a lot of detail here, by the way. Don't worry about memorizing all this. I'm trying to give you some perspective. The first thing the IRS sees on the narrative is the name of the person that's representing you. They see it on line 7. So they know. So if, put yourself in the position of the examiner, stacks and stacks of these things, prepared by people that, 75% mostly don't know what they're doing, and they're like, holy cow, I mean, they want to approve them, but they're like, whew, this needs so much, what their term is development. They need a lot of development. Then they get these professionally prepared ones. They see certain people's names, certain company names, companies are disclosed, who was paid. That's all right on there. They go, these people know what they're doing. I like to think that goes a long way. By the way, there's total transparency. So whatever is going on this application, I mean, it becomes public record. We're going to take you through a vetting process too. We don't want to, because our names are on it, we want to make sure that everything is done correctly to the code, right? Makes sense? It's how everybody wants to do it. But unintentionally, a lot of things go sideways, and that's why you've got this 10% that get no determination and 40% that are taking 6 months or longer. Okay, 5 keys to a successful application. Required language in the Articles of Incorporation. Now, don't worry about writing these down. We'll go through each one. But these are the things that we have identified are the keys, the things that people don't necessarily know or think about, right? Completing the correct schedule. It sounds kind of obvious, but depending on what you're doing, there's an ancillary schedule that's submitted with that application. So if you're a church, it's Schedule A. If you're doing scholarship programs, if you're operating a school, they have different schedules. And you have to know what the IRS's definition of a school is. If it's an after-school program, is that a school according to the IRS, right? What is a church according to the IRS? So it's not what we think it is, it's what they say it is, right? So if you don't complete that schedule, then your application gets derailed. Realistic financials, talk about that in a minute. Very important that your financials match your programs. So, the money that you need to, if you're going to operate a homeless shelter, your financials that you're submitting need to logically support the cost of doing that, right? So otherwise it looks like it's not well thought out and got some challenges. Detailed programs, descriptions, and narratives, and then knowing how to respond to the IRS questions. All right, so let's break this down, and while we're doing that, I'm going to check the time. Okay, good. Statement of purpose, dissolution clause, and conflict of interest statement. Now, I mentioned this earlier on. I said be sure that you pay attention to this IRS required language. This is the component that must be included in your Articles of Incorporation. The good news is you're going to use Andersen Advisors to file your Articles of Incorporation. This is your corporate structure. So they're going to include this in your articles. But this is a fundamental piece that must be included. It's what the IRS calls the organizational test. And so if these are paragraphs, these are the titles, but there's actually paragraphs of IRS-specific language that must be included in your articles. If it's not in there, the first thing the IRS does is they cash your application fee, because there is a fee to apply, and then they send your whole packet back, and they tell you your articles are deficient and you need to get them up to speed. They don't tell you what to include a lot of times. So, a lot of people, I can't tell you, David, how many people self-file articles and try to do this on their own, and then their articles have these deficiencies. This is the number one problem. And by the way, we do a lot of work for, CPAs, lawyers, other people. They don't do this all the time, and so even though they're professionals, they don't realize that this language needs to be included. This happens a lot. You'd be amazed. So very important. Make sure that you're using Andersen, they know what they're doing. Of course, you don't have to worry about that. Required schedules, I just mentioned this. Again, these are special schedules. Really common ones that come up are B, schools, because they encompass a lot of different organizations. F, homes for elderly, people with disabilities, low income, and then H, scholarships and educational loans and grants. Very common. We don't see a lot of medical research. There are actually other schedules as well, but these are the ones that are more common, particularly the ones that I just mentioned. And some of these schedules require a lot of additional off-the-form explanation. So, for example, if you're offering if you want to have a scholarship program, and it could be very modest, we're going to give $100 or $250 scholarship. Well, we need to explain, like if we're doing this for you, how these scholarships are going to be awarded, who is excluded from the process, how is the determination made of what do they have to do to qualify, can they get a second one, are they restricted, how does the organization track the benefit of the scholarship? In other words, did the student send their transcript or some measurement, some metric of success? Like all of that has to be explained up front, right? That's why we do this for folks, because we've worked with dozens and dozens of scholarship programs. So you know what the IRS is looking for. We help you write this stuff. Okay, programs and narratives. This is simply the off-the-form requirement that describes the programs and the activities of your organization and what it will do to further the exempt purpose. Now, this is the key IRS language, exempt purpose. Remember in the beginning we talked about 501c3, charitable, religious, educational, right? Well, those are all exempt purposes. So your programs and activities, one, have to be described, what are you doing? Okay, so we're holding a concert for veterans, right? So that would be an activity. How does that further the exempt purpose? Well, the funds that are raised are going to provide a counseling for veterans with PTSD, right? So there's going to be a description of that. Programs and narratives are the off-the-form requirements. This form is not just checking a bunch of boxes. This is actually saying, yes, we're going to have these types of programs, and then writing a little mini book report, or if you want to call it a term paper, describing programs and narratives. When you don't describe these in sufficient detail, again, that's where you get a lot of questions down the road. The IRS will ask, or they will make a negative determination. If you cannot provide this information after request, they will close your file, and they will say we're ruling not in favor of you. Okay. Realistic financials. I mentioned this a little bit. Here are some of the components on the required in the financials. So 3 to 4 year projections forward. What are you going to be bringing in gifts, grants, and contributions? Are you going to have something that you're selling? A lot of our organizations we work with provide services. So they could be providing, I use the counseling example, they might be providing counseling on a sliding scale basis based on somebody's financial capacity, right? They could be selling, everybody remember the Livestrong wristbands, the Girl Scout cookies, that's sale of merchandise or services. It's broken down a different way. Organization's overhead, what is it going to cost to run this thing? And then the amount of gifts, grants, or services or assistance paid out. So these are kind of the big chunk categories. Of course, we break it down in a lot more detail. Now, I want to focus on this portion of the most important part, in my opinion, which is the realistic word, because, again, I mentioned earlier your programs and activities and your financials have to match up. So we've done a couple of organizations that are restoring historic aircraft, right? And as you can imagine, in one case it's helicopters, in the other case it's a special airplane. That's an expensive deal, right? It doesn't, it costs some money to do that. So when the financials go in, we have to project accurately, or to the best of our knowledge, what we think it's going to cost to do that. So if our financials say, well, we're only going to be raising $5,000 a year, but we're restoring a Vietnam-era UH-1 Huey helicopter, that's not going to work. And that's one of the things that the examiners are looking for. Now, you don't have to have an MBA to do this. I mean, and this is the fun part about it for us. We work with people. We have worked with Nobel Prize winners. We've worked with people that Nobel Prize for economics. I mean, crazy, right? Super bright people. They still didn't want to do this, or couldn't do it, or said, threw their arms up in the air, right? Some people, if you've had a business, you might not struggle with it. If you've never been in business, this could be a real challenge. It holds people up, right? So we walk you through it. We also know what the expectations are based on these financials, right? That type of organization, what it's going to cost. You're going to open a thrift store. What would that cost? A homeless shelter. What would that cost, right? An outreach food program. What would that cost? And, we're going to do this so that we don't get questions, right, on these financials, which leads to this. after your whole packet's been submitted and you've done all this stuff and you've got your people together, you got your corporation, you got your application, you did your narratives, you did your financials, you did proper schedule, you send it all in, and then it gets quiet for a while. And this is, I'm going to say, it's kind of funny. Sometimes people say, wow, I forgot I had applied, because some of the delays going back a year ago were so long, they forgot. And literally, all of a sudden, a letter would show up, and they have 14 to 21 days to respond. And sometimes these letters will be 5 or 6 pages of multiple part questions. And, of course, people get in a panic. Now, one of the cool things about what we do is we're licensed, and so specifically we can act on a power of attorney with the IRS so that we get the correspondence, right? So that if the applicant, you, is on vacation, unavailable, you're moving, whatever, all of a sudden this letter shows up, we get a copy, and we can respond on your behalf. Now, we don't answer the questions on your behalf because we don't know the answers, right? We're going to work together and develop those. But what we can do is call the examiner and say, hey, if I'm me talking, hey, I haven't been able to get a hold of the client, can we have an extension on answering these questions? They're always very gracious. They'll say, yeah, absolutely, no problem. What do you need? How long do you need? Or sometimes they'll just tell you, well, you have till this date to respond. But at least we're not running the risk of that file getting closed out, right? No one responded. We did all of this work and then to have these things closed out. And that's what we call the fire drill, right? So we're going to do that. And once you've made it through this entire gauntlet and hurdle, guess what? You get that positive letter of determination. And that is literally a letter that says that, under a certain section code, the IRS has approved your organization. And that is one of the most rewarding times for us. Which, again, if we're on a power of attorney, we usually get it before the client, sometimes a few days before. Sometimes the clients don't get them, and we only get them. And we get to call the client and say, hey, great news. Guess what? They're like, what? We tell them, your letter came in, and in a lot of cases now we've received the letter with no questions, right? So we've done such a good job on the front end of answering and addressing anything that we potentially thought the IRS would ask, that the IRS has approved your organization. And that is a great time for celebration. Now, of course, does it end there? No, it's just beginning. If you've ever opened a business, go through all those cycles and you finally swing the doors open and you're ready, and now you got to run the business. Same thing's true with the nonprofit. These are no different than for-profit businesses, right? Their functionality is the same, and for business owners and people that part of the Anderson Advisors, a lot of business-minded people, you get this stuff, right? And it's all about those efficiencies and so on. So I'm just going to wrap this up. We're going to go into Q&A here in just a second. I always say now is your time. It's a great time for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons I think it's pretty unique is that we've seen a movement going on in America, and I believe personally, and partially from what happened in the economy. We had the worst economic situation in 60 years since the Great Depression, and I think a lot of people went through a reset, and either they went through a financial reset, or they went through a psychological reset, or they went through both, but they kind of said, what is my life, and what is this all about? What is my true calling and purpose? And every one of those pictures that you see are people that we have helped get tax-exempt status, and literally people from, I like to say, it transcends age, race, economics, all of the things that sometimes in politics that seems to divide us in America comes together with nonprofits. And that is one of the most rewarding things when we get to hear what all of these folks are doing all over the country, and it's super cool. So if you've ever considered doing this and thought about maybe this is the time, or you've put it off for a long time, it'll be a good time to fill out that form, and we're going to chat. You'll talk actually directly with me, and we'll have a conversation, and we'll just say I can answer your questions and kind of take you through this process in a little bit more detail. All right, so now's your time. Get to live your life's purpose. It's pretty cool. Extension for what a lot of you are already doing, right? So many people are out there doing charitable works and things already. Maybe you have a special message to share or something that you'd like to get out there as well. A lot of the ones we've done are people with historical connections, really fascinating stuff that they're just getting the message out. Sometimes it's oral histories that are not written, that people are sharing from generation to generation as we move into this electronic age, and especially young people today. They're not reading as much, and they're texting and all of that. Some of this stuff is really important. All right, so David, I'm ready to roll through some questions.
Sounds good. So for those on the call, what we're going to do is to go through the questions. If you just fill out the question at the bottom of this page, down on the scroll all the way down to the bottom, it'll say name, email, and add a comment. And you can just ask your questions right in there, and that'll get to us, and we'll get to all of those. The first one that's in there is from Kiz. And it's how do I use and I'm not sure you would know this better than I, Mark, but he says 508A1C to stay in compliance with the IRS without having a church building. Is he talking about a 501c?
Well, it sounds like a determination for a church, and so and I will say honestly too, a lot of people are challenged with asking the question because a lot of this stuff isn't clear. If the question is related to having a physical location to maintain church status, and that sounds like what it is, the answer is generally that's true. However, there are exceptions, and this is a great question because it just came up literally yesterday, where someone was determined to be a ministry as opposed to a church, and one of the criteria that's applied to receive church status is having a fixed place of worship. Now, a number of the folks that we've worked with to get church status are borrowing a church. Like literally they have partnered with another church, and so they're offering services on the downtime of that church, sometimes different denominations. It's actually kind of a cool thing. In case people are wondering about the difference between a church and a ministry, and I think this is really important because people want to sometimes lump them together, the distinction is a church is a much more favored status for this reason, and that is that churches, if you're deemed a church, they do not have to file a tax return with the Internal Revenue Service. So once you receive church status, now of course the IRS can examine or set in motion what they would call a redetermination based on somebody reporting abuse or whistleblower case or something like that, but generally speaking, there is no tax return that's filed. So there's no accountability. Once you get church status, it's like literally, hallelujah, right? There's no return. Ministries, on the other hand, file what's called a 990. So there is an accountability piece related to things like salaries and operating expenses. And, again, we talk about tax laws, excessive benefit transactions. There's all kinds of things that can occur that are bad things, right? Put it that way, that we will custodian you to avoid, of course. But that's the distinction. So, to answer the question, you don't have to have a fixed location. However, it is one of the criteria of many that the IRS does apply.
Now, several people are filling out the request to speak with you directly. So what I want to do is just confirm with you, those that are on the call that didn't maybe hear at the beginning, if you fill out your first name, last name, email, and the phone there, what you're going to do is get a phone call from one of the Anderson Business Advisors reps, and they will schedule a call, if it's pertinent, for Mark directly. If we can answer the question, we will, but you want to fill out the form right below the video here, and Mark will work with you directly. Mark is the one who works with you to actually set up the nonprofit filing with the IRS, and Anderson will set up the entity for you, but Mark can help you with both pieces of that, and then the paperwork comes over to us to set up the entity, and he works with you to actually get the paperwork filed directly with the IRS to set all this up. So the next question, obviously, a lot of people are asking, which is, what are kind of the costs around this, and what is there an annual cost, and how does that associated? What's the IRS cost? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah, great questions. Okay, so generally speaking, you're going to have a cost to form the entity, right? So there's a couple of different pieces that are occurring here. So one is getting that nonprofit corporation in place. There are going to be some variables with that, and it could range from $1,000 to $2,000, something like that, depending on your fees, estate fees, and things like that, right? And then there's a fee for us to do what we do. And so depending on which track we go down, and this is the part that's hard to explain in this forum, but if we go down a long forum track, which is an extensive process of items that we're going to be putting together, all of the things that we discussed tonight, your financials, your narratives, your explanations, your schedules, all of those things, your bylaws, everything else, that fee is $3,000. If we are able to do the streamlined approach, which is a abbreviated version of that, then that's less depending on your agenda, because what we're going to do is we're going to have to anticipate what kind of questions could the IRS have based on your agenda. And I know it sounds a little bit vague, but it really it depends on that, because as I mentioned, like organizations operating outside the U.S. have a much higher level of due diligence. Certain types of organizations, so organizations that are offering financial counseling, things like foreclosure mitigation, stuff like that, they're on the hot list of the IRS. They're going to ask a lot of questions. Okay. Now, as far as the application process is concerned, there's a two-part array. I'd rather say there's two different fees. Some simple way to put it for the IRS. So smaller organizations that, let's say, qualify for the abbreviated application process, their application fee is $400, and that check is written out directly to Department of Treasury. For the long-form applicants, which in one way to put it would be larger organizations, churches have to be long-form. Certain types of organizations are mandated to be long-form. That application to the Department of Treasury is $850. Now, those application fees are not submitted until everything is completed and ready to go. So depending on how fast and how prepared the client is, and how fast we move on it, we're going to move fast because this is the end of the year. We want to get these. We're in fourth quarter now. We want to get your applications in. We want to get these wound up this year. We want to get you approved before this year is up. So think about this for a minute. Some people have been taking donations already, and there's this question of deductibility. There may be people on this call that have set up a nonprofit corporation but never applied, and that's a very unique case because depending on the facts and circumstances, the IRS will backdate your approval to your date of incorporation, right? So that could be pretty cool. You could have formed the corporation 2 years ago, just getting around to doing this, and they'll backdate your approval two years, in the past. So again, we work with you based on these different sets of facts and circumstances. After that, of course, you're going to maintain your resident agent. You might have some ancillary services. There are no additional fees to the IRS or any kind of maintenance fees related to the IRS side of this. So, once you're approved, there is an informational tax return. Organizations at $50,000 or less, it's an online. Really, it's a questionnaire. It's not even a form. Super simple. And then as you scale up, you have what's an easy tax return, and then you have a full-on what they call 990, which is a more involved tax return. But this is for organizations that are $250,000 or more. So you may have a little prep work on that as well.
Okay, so the next question is related to churches, and it's are churches are supposed to be under common law but not the tax code. Being under the tax code, the government can control churches to go against their beliefs. Is there a better way for churches to be set up and large donations still be tax-free? If a church is a 501c3, can it unwind from the 501c3?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's something that we encounter more of. I'll tell you why. Technically, in the Internal Revenue Code, it says that churches do not have to apply. So the reality is, on one hand, the position of the government is, if you're a church, a bona fide church, there is no application process. However, what we've seen is a number of churches, and a large number of churches, go through the formal application process to receive that letter of determination, so that they have the blessing, so that the IRS cannot go to what is suspected to be fraudulent in their view, that has never applied, that they've never vetted or approved, and say, hey, you owe 3 years of for-profit tax returns and things like that. I will say this: I think that the concern that somehow the government's going to pull church status, I think that is a very, very unpopular position, that the service would not take that position. In fact, when you read the internal documents, and we have literally thousands of pages of documents that were obtained by Freedom of Information Act related to determinations, they are very silk gloves when it comes to religious organizations, very cautious about things like that. So, again, you get into constitutional issues, and it's not something that the IRS is out focusing on. They have much bigger things to go after than already approved nonprofits that went through the whole process.
Great. And so the next question is, what is a corporation's soul, and can it be a nonprofit?
Yeah, corporation sole. I mean, it's an odd provision in certain states' statutory laws that allow you to set up a religious organization. It doesn't fall under the definition of a church, and you can use a corporation sole to apply for tax exempt status. It does meet the requirement of being a corporation. It also has to have, though, or must have that IRS required language that the organizational language that we talked about. Part of that language says that no part of the profits or net profits are going to benefit individuals. Now, one of the things that was around years ago, let's say a dozen years ago, were promoters that were promoting corporation soles to people that had for-profit businesses. And I don't know if you remember in the day, David, but there used to be a lot of those filings, and people were really the intentions were not correct. Let me just put it that way, right? And of course, the Internal Revenue Service, they know when things are happening. They know by not what people are doing necessarily. They see it from the promoters, and when promoters are out there, tax exempt business trusts and things like that. I mean, the service will come in and they'll look on state records and they'll see everybody that formed these, and they'll start sending out notices of audit, right? So it's not something we see a lot of. We see standard nonprofit corporations with the IRS language and then applying, let's say, for ministry status or some type of religious thing. We've done a number where they're a religious ceremonial aspect of a larger religion. Some of it very what we might consider odd, right? That we've had to describe to the IRS, and the examiners have had a pretty it gets assigned to somebody that's familiar with this, and they have a pretty good knowledge base of what's supposed to happen, and so it goes through that vetting process.
And do you provide a compliance service or consultation service to keep entities in compliance?
Well, definitely, and I think that's a two-part question. I mean, you have the resident agent component and what Anderson Advisors does from the corporate perspective. So, some states require annual list of officers that's filed. Nevada, of course, does. So, that's a component of it as well. There's the nonprofit compliance piece, which is what we handle, which is tax returns. So, if somebody has a nonprofit tax return, and also charitable fundraising solicitation registrations, which is kind of a big deal now because most people are aware the states, are pretty hard up for money, and so there are nonprofits that are operating and fundraising with a presence in a state. If the state requires that they register their fundraising activities, they can be subject to civil and in some cases criminal penalties for non-registration. So there's 42 states require that. So yeah, we do those as well. I'll tell you a great story, David. We have a client that a year ago ran across the United States for a very specific form of cancer that he was creating awareness and raising funds for. It was good. The guy literally ran like every step of the way. And so he started in the Bay Area, and he got to Utah. And, of course, as I mentioned, you get a lot of publicity and media coverage, right? So, it's an interesting guy. And he has all these tattoos, and he's a young guy. He's kind of crazy looking, and he has a motorhome following him. So, long story short, the reporter says, "Oh, are you registered in the state to fundraise?" And, he had somebody handling his paperwork. He called us in a panic, and he said, well, literally from his cell phone while he was running. And we said, well, okay, yes, what states are you planning on passing through? We'll jumpstart ahead of you and get these registrations done. It was kind of cute because it was something he hadn't thought of. And, like I said, somebody else was managing this for him. They didn't realize, well, yeah, if you have a presence and you're on television saying, hey, come out and meet us and donate or whatever, clearly that was a problem. So the answer is yes, we do that.
Awesome. Yeah, one quick comment on the corporation sole. We don't form those or act as resident agent here at Anderson for those. So if we prefer to file nonprofit corporations directly. So if that's something somebody's interested in, it's probably not something we would do. Next question: how to avoid conflict of interest and the perception of conflict of interest with other for-profit ventures?
Oh, great question. All right. So, we have some entrepreneurs on this call. I know that. And I know there's people on this call that have for-profit businesses. And I can just sense it from the demographics of Anderson Advisors. So this happens or comes up a lot. So let's talk about conflict of interest, what it is and what it isn't. A relationship between a for-profit business, let's say, or for-profit company, and a nonprofit organization with common control, all right? We would say common ownership, but technically the nonprofit doesn't have ownership per se. It doesn't have stock. So let's say common control. That is not a non-starter, okay? So specifically, there are, countless organizations, and most large companies have, Ronald McDonald House is, an entity connected to McDonald's, for example, right? So it's very common. Here's how we avoid conflict of interest. First of all, we need to understand what the IRS's definition is of conflict of interest. Secondly, we need to disclose all of these relationships up front. Again, I said earlier, there is transparency in this entire process. One of the requirements is, the IRS asks, how are people related by family, blood, marriage? Also, how are they related by business? Okay, and so, for example, and this is where the IRS really had a problem a few years back, organizations that were getting approved as credit counseling organizations, and they were nonprofits. You imagine people are in a desperate spot and they want to negotiate their credit card debt or their consumer debt. So they go to these things, and all these people were doing was selling off their names to, high interest credit card companies or credit offers or whatever. You can use your imagination, right? There really was nothing charitable about it. They weren't negotiating people's debt. They weren't doing anything related to the exempt purpose that they were approved for. Because remember, we're demonstrating what is our exempt purpose. So the IRS is very aware of these things. Now, if there is a relationship that is disclosed, okay, where it's not personally benefiting the individuals, the owners of that for-profit, it's not a direct benefit, that's okay. I'm going to give you a great example. We did a thrift store for a woman. And, this is kind of how things go sideways, too. It's a great story in a lot of ways, but she wanted to buy a particular building. We went through this whole process of, the building and the description and the financials and the whole deal, and it goes into the IRS, and they asked, who owns the building? So we said, well, that's a reasonable question. Well, we asked the client, and she said, oh, my mom. Oh, boy. All right. Well, why wasn't that disclosed? Because, again, I kind of short-circuited the process, but when we do this, one of the things we're going to do to protect you and protect us is we're going to have a chat, right? We're going to find out what you want to do. You're going to lay it out for us. We're going to tell you, yep, that's no problem. Oh, we can do that. You can't do that, but here's how we can do that, okay? Because, again, number one thing, we're going to keep you in compliance and do this the right way. So, we had to develop and demonstrate that she was renting that building at fair market value, that she had letters from appraisers in that market that said, yes, the building was fair market value, okay, and that she had looked at other alternatives, and we described those alternatives. So the service went ahead and approved it. So it's a good example. Now, is that the correct way to do it? No. The client should have disclosed up front because we ask these questions. We say, well, who is this? Is this fair market value for the rent? Have you done a rent study? No different than compensation. If somebody says, I want to pay myself, that's fantastic. Roger Goodell, he's the chairman of the NFL. He makes $22 million a year. He works for a nonprofit. I guess the IRS is okay with that because it's all fully disclosed. It's transparent. So they do have challenges with unreasonable or excessive salary. We're going to talk about that. Most hospitals in the United States are nonprofits. People that run hospital companies make in the millions. College football coaches work for nonprofit universities. They make in the millions, right? So the problem isn't necessarily what's happening. It's how is it disclosed and does it meet what the IRS requires, right? And we're very careful about these things. We work with a number of entrepreneurs. Good example, another one we did was a lady, Harvard graduate, and Harvard Law and MBA, and she has a company in New York. She has a kitchen where they film all these cooking shows that you see, and they have multiple kitchens and sets, and it's super cool, right? Well, one of the things she wanted to do was teach kids, minority kids and ethnic kids, traditional cooking techniques, and so she's using this kitchen, which is very elaborate. It's, broadcast quality studio, right? And so, yeah, just because she's using that and she may be paying some ancillary fees related to that studio wasn't a non-starter, right? Again, it was just disclosed. Here's the for-profit business, here's the nonprofit, and here's where they meet in the middle.
Great. So we have a few more questions, but again, just throw it out there for if you jumped into the call really late. If you want to speak with Mark directly about setting up a nonprofit and having him do this paperwork and that for you, I think he just explained why you would pay somebody to do this for you. So yes, some of the questions on there, can I do this on my own? Do I have to hire a service? Of course, you can do anything like this on your own, just like you can go file your own tax returns. You can go do all the, but it's so much nicer, so much easier when you're using a professional to do it the first time to make sure it's done right, that you don't have the IRS coming back to you to ask all these questions. So I'm right there with you, Mark, in terms of I love to pay people to do services like this so that I'm not messing with it later on. A couple more questions that came in. One was, and I'll go through these, but again, if you want to speak with Mark about this, fill out that form, and one of our representatives at Anderson will give you a call and then schedule a time with Mark to set that up. And we have a lot of people on this call and a lot of people that have already filled out that form, so forgive us if it takes a couple days to get it to scheduled where Mark is in there. Mark does want to talk to everybody who wants to set one of these up, so he can do that. But give us a little bit of time when we do that. Next couple questions here. We'll just take 5 more minutes and go through the last couple questions. I'm going to skip a few, and if your question doesn't get answered, I'll sit with Mark after the call and we'll hand type in the answers here afterwards. But one of them came up was, I don't suppose you can have a personal charitable reindeer trust and keep an arm's length separation to another nonprofit you have properly set up, or if it is possible, any advantages?
All right, well, that's a great question, and I'm gonna punt on that one simply because in some of these more complex structures, right, we're now overlapping into what could be the area of law. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so, depending on, I'm certainly not an attorney and I'm not an expert on trusts, and Anderson Advisors has the competent legal advisors there that can work with that. I mean, that said, we will work with this to make sure that it's a structure that is, number one, it's legal from both the legalities and the tax perspective, and not going to create some kind of issues or trouble later. And remember, again, when we're going through an application process, it's related to that last question. It's disclosure and transparency, right? So what are the motivations for doing this? We're going to describe that to the service. We're going to leave it up to them to do their due diligence and ask the questions that they can. Part of what we do, and it's no different than attorneys and when we talk about case precedents and things like that. I mean, I spend a tremendous amount of time looking up revenue rulings, which are specific requests that the service had about how does a particular organization fit under the definition of 501c3. Remember I said there's, you have that general definition and then you have everything under the sun. And is it charitable? Is it educational? And there's very specific language that the IRS uses. So when I do a narrative, and when we're writing narratives here, we include revenue rulings specific to that agenda. So we actually say, just like citing a case, here are some examples of a similar set of facts and circumstances where the service approved that. I don't know of any other company or folks that do this, at least not for this kind of pricing. I mean, if you're going to hire a Washington, D.C. law firm that only does nonprofits, yeah, they'll do it for you. They're going to charge you $15,000, $25,000 to do this. I mean, when you get into that much detail. So, again, it's looking for similar situations and also overlapping into the legal a little bit.
Got it. And then we're going to take one more question, and that is, can a private foundation or private operating foundation have multiple purposes?
The answer is yes, and it's fairly common that you'll see that. A related question to that is, our intention when we submitted our paperwork, whether it's a foundation or a nonprofit, we had a specific purpose or agenda in mind, and that has changed or is no longer relevant. Let's say laws or public opinion changes or a lot of different things. So or maybe the problem's been mitigated or resolved to a certain extent. So here's where that gets picked up. It gets picked up in the tax returns that are filed. So there will be a statement of programs in there, and the IRS does have the right to be able to make a redetermination on an organization that is not following the exempt purpose of what they were approved to do. But again, if the new purpose is in alignment with the definition of 501c3, then, and that can be demonstrated. I mean, the reality is, while it can happen, it's very, very rare that it does happen. We do work redeterminations from time to time. So we have clients where they've gone through the process and the service says, you're a 6 or you're a 4. And we said, no, they're a 3. And I'll go back through and I have yet to lose one. So, we'll cite the revenue rulings, we'll cite the Treasury regs, we'll pull out the authority and say, oh, here's why it fits. And, again, they're good people over there, but sometimes they make us work a little harder for it.
Sounds good. So again, those that have other questions in here, I'll work with Mark to get those answered, so that we aren't taking everybody's time up beyond the 1 hour. So we'll go ahead and complete today's call. Again, Mark, I want to thank you for your time and sharing with everybody about nonprofits and the foundations. I think it's been very educational for a lot of people. And again, Mark can sit down with you one-on-one, just fill out the form right there. Give us a little bit of time to get the appointments scheduled, as we've got lots of them already on the list. So, Mark, anything else?
That's it. I just want to thank everyone for, again, spending their time with us and also even considering this as an option. I think particularly for entrepreneurs, this is a very, very interesting option for people. And we're seeing more and more very entrepreneurial people moving into this space and understanding how they can leverage, what is in the tax code, and also, of course, have a benefit and an impact. It's amazing when we think about and internally talk about all of these people we've worked with. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing and amazing. And so, that's why we do it, and I think that's why people were on this call. So think about what that purpose is. Start with writing that mission statement. That's a great way to develop it further. But thank you everyone. Thanks for Anderson Advisors for having me, and you as well, David. I know we've known each other a long time, and I appreciate being here tonight. It's really cool.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.